Let me wait for it to connect.
In case you should also record it.
Yep. Okay, so we are live on the custom stream. And we turn on the recording. And great. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today. We're going to be reviewing students from myself, Mathew Al, and Marcelyn Gao, who are completing their thesis projects for their MARC1 and MARC2 sequence. Prior to the thesis studio, which runs over the summer, the students also had a seminar in the spring where they developed their research and preparation for their project. So this is really a kind of 2-semester long accumulation of their academic career here at SCI-Arc. We're going to be trying to keep things on the schedule to help with people that are watching on YouTube Live, family members and friends that are logging on for each student. But we wanted to get started by introducing the jury so that the students can kind of pair face to person. I'll briefly introduce you, and then if you guys could just introduce yourselves really quickly, that would be great. We'll start with Hina, Jamelle, who is a faculty member at UPenn and has an architecture practice in New York. We say hi. Thanks. We have Gabriel Esquivel, who is a faculty member at Texas A&M and additionally has a practice in Texas. Kutan Ayata, who is joining the faculty. Oh, sorry. Kutan Ayata, who is joining the faculty of UCLA this fall and has a practice young in Ayata, which I'm guessing will be based in both cities moving forward. Hernan Diaz Alonso, who is the director of SCI-Arc here at SCI. And also we're being joined by Mollie Claypool, who is a faculty member at the Bartlett and is in the middle of constructing an installation. So we'll see how long she lasts over in the UK. So thank you all for joining us. Do Matt or Marcelyn, do you have any introductory comments before?
Just really want to welcome everyone, and just to contextualize the graduate thesis, the students have been working since June 1st on these projects, and thesis is also a 2-semester endeavor. So there was a whole semester of thesis prep that took place in the spring, and this is the culmination of their MARC degrees. So it's a combination of MARC1 and MARC2 students, and they'll be graduating on Sunday.
I don't have anything to add other than just saying hello and thank you for coming.
Okay, so we're a bit ahead of schedule, but I think it's okay for us to get started. JIAYUE He, are you ready to present?
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, let me share my screen. Can you see it? Can you see my screen? Can you hear me well?
Yep, everything looks great.
Okay.
Feel free to start whenever you're ready.
Okay, so here is my thesis project. My thesis considers the possibility of an architecture that has the capacity to undergo formal and material transformations. It's an investigation into the multiplicity of spatial existence and architecture in flux. So now please join me on the journey of a fiction story. In 1870, at the edge of Mono Lake, the county decided to build a mining camp for prospectors and miners. However, the township were quickly abandoned. In 2020, the Mono County decided to build a geological research center on top of the abandoned site. 100 years later, parts of the building break down and change its appearance. The design threads abandoned mining sheds together and absorb them into a new building, which is layered in different materials and constructions. It combines the element appears as thick mass and thin surfaces together to anticipate how it could behave differently throughout its lifetime. The inner layer is combination of stone structure and steel frame glazing, and the outer layer is constructed with bridge blocks hanging by steel cable. The design allows the building to have multiple existence throughout its lifespan. The program changes in stage from research lab to artist residency. Also, through layers of different material and building structure, the project investigates the possibility of unstable form and raw material qualities in the matter of transformation and breakdown. First, the building is completely constructed with 3 layers: inner stone mass, adjacent steel framing, and bridge block. Next, the bridge block starts to break down. The building remains as a combination of 2 inner structures. Last, only the stone structure remains. The building has transformed into individual objects. And here are some images showing the sequential existence of historical and new buildings. Now I have a short film to illustrate the story and the idea.
In 1859, after the discovery of a profitable line of gold at the edge of Sierra Nevada mountain range, the Mono Lake County in California decided to build a mining town for prospectors and miners. By the year of 1870, the newly built township an isolated mining camp. The houses were built with a collection of timber sheds on top of stone foundations. Timbers for construction are harvested from Douglas fir in the Sierra Mountain. Stones are collected around the lake on site. However, as other promising miner booms all over the United States, these houses were quickly abandoned during the early 20th century. For almost 100 years, these timber sheds sat there along the lake, exposed to the sun and rain. By 2018, only a mound of dirt and the foundation still remained. When Mono County has decided to build a geological research center to study the tufa rocks around the lake. To emphasize the historical content, the new building takes place on top of the foundation from abandoned historical township, designed to break down with anticipation with layered materials, corresponding to the old construction of timber frame and stone foundation. The design of the new building combines modern interpretation of framing structure made of steel and glazing, with stone mass constructed with recycled material collected from abandoned ruins. To anticipate material breakdown, the outer layer is constructed with bridge blocks hanging by steel cable. Another 100 years passes by. The building has transformed its appearance by the year of 2150. The bridge blocks starts to break and fall down. Bricks are crumbling, falling, and the remains piled up on the ground. The steel has rusted on the surface. The paint on the wall has peeled off, revealing the stone structures underneath. The building decays into separate individual blocks where it provides residency for artists who work closely with nature and line art. What would be the end of it? Whether it would be abandoned again and everything goes back to the earth, or be absorbed into a new architecture of the future design. The question takes architecture as an inherently material and subject to process of entropy.
That's it. Thank you.
JIAYUE, maybe I have a question about the way in which you're working with the video, the film, and the kind of sort of dissolve move that you have, that scene, which right now is almost invisible. There are moments where it's very, very like subtle. And then there are moments where it's very overt, that you're kind of sweeping from one time period to another. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, like the whole way in which you've choreographed the space in the film and how that supports this idea of entropic dissolution of architecture.
I think in a way, I'm setting up the film as showing two different stages side by side, but at the same time using this linear wipe effect to kind of emphasize that it's also from one stage going into another. So sometimes it could blend the two stages together as a new existence, but also at the same time, it kind of records what's previous and anticipate what's coming next in the future.
It's an effective technique, right? To be able to show time. I think that if there was, when you have a very barren landscape, and then you're almost hopeful when you reach this particular moment where there's this new construction on a past that was built before, and yet it's beginning to register in other ways. That, I mean, the way that it blows away, almost like a fragility, or, you know, you seem to be time compressing a lot. I mean, you could continue with this almost, right? Where, and it brings into question, one thinks of architecture and permanence, one thinks of architecture and legacy, one thinks of architecture as having, you know, something that, you know, is at least permanent in a world that a lot of things are not. But you're drawing into question that very concept by you know, looking at almost like a site as an excavation, which I find to be super interesting. And then to see it dissolve is also a little, you know, it's disarming. But I think that the way you've done it, the way this slow, panoramic time, you know, you're moving it almost like someone with a handheld camera, where it's not smooth. But then some of these aspects of where the brick disappears and then crumbles, that's done in a very sophisticated way. So you've got multiple things going on. The camera, which is jerking, and I don't know if that's on purpose, but then the very smooth, almost instantaneous dissolving of material here, where, you know, you do it in one fair smooth. Plus you're also showing you know, rusting. Is there something here that you think landscape doesn't participate in your process at all? Like the same, even though a lot of time has gone by, where these bricks have gone from a very focused formation, I would say, to then, you know, resulting like this in a certain number of time. I just want to talk about time a little bit as you see it, right? I mean, am I seeing it correctly in that you're seeing this as over, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and yet the landscape remains the way it is? I mean, I'm talking also even the green, which, you know, might also have its own senses of cycles. So can you talk a little bit about that?
I think in a way it has the anticipation with the environment would change, because for example, the brick falling down is also kind of a reaction to that the water level would raise, and also the ground would have a pile of dirt building on top of the existing ground. So it's definitely taking the landscape into the consideration into the project.
I mean, I think that it's interesting to me, because if I think of entropy has to have some kind of material degradation that is generally associated to the idea of thermal degradation. So there's really this conflict about the idea of how there's the scientific take on the entropy, which, you know, sort of measures that at atomic molecular level, the idea of degradation. So the material is really, you know, with the effect more than time is really thermal degradation. But at the same time, the movie really presents other idea in terms of one is seen more as a documentary style with a camera, and is really sort of taken account into more of the issue of their narrative of that degradation. And on the other side, the sort of entropic process is really more about other sort of more scientific point of view in a way, right? So it's really, to me, it really begins to mix two conditions of the way that you see degradation. One from other conditions that have to do with their specifically with the environment via heat, etc. And the other one is really the kind of more poetic, so more sort of narrative aspect of it, as the kind of documentary sort of style really depicts that that degradation as something that has to do with another level of like the poetics of the material doing that and the rescue of that. So I find those two conditions really quite interesting in the way that, you know, she begins to sort of combine them. But I would ask her a little bit more if there was such considerations about material degradation as such in terms of the entropic process, more scientifically understood, you know, other than more as part of the narrative.
Just to follow up on that, I think there's something brilliant about how we're just circling within the project. Just keep looking at the same thing from its center towards its periphery, almost denying a larger context. And that fits well in some way in the way it's set up episodically, meaning we have only seen one site image of the project, and from that image we associate a certain ecology, certain condition with regards to where we are, and then we are kind of dead center in the project, unable to see beyond horizons like this, but really and sorry, I'm getting kind of an echo. This is super interesting for me, and I wonder to kind of take Gabe's suggestion a little further, to think this material transformation could have happen with smaller increments, not necessarily by just making a decision of when something would eventually fail or fall, but there are probably steps towards that failing, meaning surface degradation, weathering, kind of eroding on a smaller scale before we get to a point of failure. And I think if, as you carry this project forward, if you kind of think about those scales that operate within, that might bring more plausibility, that would also support these large stages of transformation in which you kind of, I guess, change the identity of architecture from one thing to another. The nuances that might operate in between those large points could produce other kind of conditions and habitations, and potentially shifting associations with regards to the architecture. What's for me is interesting, and maybe a little in conflict in the way, I guess you're naming your project Architecture in Flux. Everything you showed and talked about points me to an architecture that's permanent, but like eventually kind of succumbs to time. And I'm left with more, I guess, with concepts of flux with regards to how it could feel different, be used differently, or be aimed at different constituents, human and non-human, given the site that we are. And given the timeline that you're establishing, then I guess the flux of architecture itself, like the physical architecture itself, or if you push, I guess, that to an extreme in which you're able to perhaps perceive through your representational technique every little increment of transformation, maybe that would register more directly in the way we understand physical conditions being in flux.
There are some moments here, just to pick up on that, there are some moments here in the landscape. I mean, marble, you use every material that one can think of. The marble remains unchanged from what I can see. But then the sort of footprints of the artist colony, and I remember, I think it's coming up, but there's like this series of the vestiges of the foundation that are left in the ground. I find, I think here coming up, it seems to be like its own kind of landscape, which I find to be quite interesting as a new kind of scarring on the ground. I find the idea about the vegetation still to be a bit problematic because, even though there's a perceived time that's gone by, this still seems to be, this one here, like you've got these sort of plates that are sort of embedded like a new tapestry on the ground plane. That might be doing more of what Kutan is asking, which is, where do you see these gradual moments of sand accumulating, of weathering, of material change, more so than I think in the structures and the more visible deterioration that you're talking about. So it's almost like an absence. It's like in the absence, there's this new ground plane, a new site, a new possibility. So I find those moments, and I don't know if there's anywhere else. I know you showed a site plan of the actual residences, but the landscape itself is very provocative to me, and I find those moments to be a little bit more clear in terms of your thesis.
I mean, I think that, picking up a little bit of Kutan was saying about the idea of flux. For me, flux has to be the issue of becoming. So there's really some transformative aspect of it. But at the same time, to me, then the one thing is really the time that is measured, or the time that takes to deteriorate material, and the other one is the time, as they're pointing out, that to actually the landscape deteriorates. So I think there's two elements working at different levels or different scales at different times, right? And I think the video sometimes really tries to talk about the landscape, and sometimes interiorizes more into the notion of is it really happening at the level of material, or is it really happening along with the landscape being deteriorated? So for me, those are two different times that play differently with each other. So I think the video begins to address that. I understand that maybe that's why the questions about why is the landscape remains, or why certain pieces remain, etc. Because to me, there's really the process of becoming is not even in all the depiction of the different things that are happening. So maybe architecture and materials sort of in a way deteriorate differently with and the landscape is also a different moment. So I think maybe that is some of the things that we're trying to reconcile, that is not really all at the same time. I don't know if that sort of makes sense, but I think it's really what I sort of think about it.
Yeah, this is in the Mono Lake area, right? And
Yeah.
Could you just remind me quickly, like what's the time frame over this kind of evolution that you're exploring?
It's from 1800 to say 2150, so about 200 years span.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's interesting to try to represent that kind of collapse in time across a site like this. It's already such a surreal landscape there, that these kind of abandoned like mine structures and things are, some of them are still kind of extant, right? We actually see some of these kind of lost foundations in the landscape too, and also like really nearby. I was just thinking while watching this, like how some of these images feel a lot like some of the sites that are maybe just on the other side of the ridge in the Sierras that had the kind of fires last year, where you really see this landscape. It's a kind of completely charred landscape with just these exposed foundations where houses used to be. I guess I kind of bring that up because a lot of the kind of transformation that you're showing, I think actually can occur in that like location in a really accelerated rate. Like it's a very kind of hostile environment for building, especially out of kind of cheap wood construction, which a lot of that older stuff was. Like the soil itself is heavily basic with like creosotes and things that kind of basically dissolve the timbers over time. I wonder about how much different this video would actually be if you were looking at like a 10-year stretch in that same site versus this 250-year stretch. Like how the kind of qualities of the site itself made you think about looking at it over this longer term, and if other sites would have like offered either more dramatic transformation, or maybe it's the fact that this site, because for numerous reasons, like it's not like a highly developed area in a country, in some ways has this kind of very clear scarring or evidence of entropy, but on the other hand doesn't really change very fast at all. Like it doesn't kind of it doesn't accelerate in the same way that if you did the same project of 200 years of like the city of Los Angeles, right? Like that'd be a very violent transformation. I think it's kind of interesting that because of the site you've chosen, you could be depicting something that is a 10-year time scale or a 200-year time scale, and I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And maybe that's more about what the project is starting to kind of explore or kind of force us to consider in relationship to your kind of building strategies.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I mean, you said it better than I did, but I was really thinking that there's really, that maybe is it really 200 years, or it really because of wood, deteriorating faster than other materials because of other factors. Is it really 200 years, or is it really way less than that? Or this is a combination of different times sort of put together. So, so the question is really, does it really take 200 years for this to happen, or it goes really way faster, right?
What I'm left wanting to see more, I think, is this particular moment that happens to the brick that's beginning to fall down and slump and accumulate to produce a particular effect. Because the project is kind of stuck between being a ruin and maybe on the other extreme, a kind of staged set of I guess, enclosures, and the only way it transforms is either through direct material decay. Let's say the steel rusts, the brick kind of dissolves, except this moment that's about to hit here, where the brick just kind of falls down and clumps. And that to me is really interesting, because if you took this to an extreme where the act of transforming this or anticipating a transformation that could be left slightly open-ended, just like this moment here, that we would probably at the most, let's say, future condition of your timeline, we would look at a very different kind of failure, right? It's kind of a failure that anticipates a certain material behavior that would, I guess, around certain set of frameworks would behave one way or another. Let's say pile, rust, and break, but in some way kind of engineer, I guess, how it would fail. And that in itself forces you to design in a very different way. It would make you, I guess, make set of decisions very differently in the present, considering how it might behave 200 years from now. And that's a very different value set in terms of design when it comes to generating architecture. It begins to kind of free itself from momentary pressures, but only deal with the physical condition of architecture, its site, its assembly, its detail, how it's held together, how it's going to break. So the parameters of how you would design begins to open up a different way of looking at how architecture can be practiced. And I'm kind of find that really fascinating, and wanting to, I guess, see now how it could fail in different ways, or it could plan to be failed in ways just like the brick does in that one scene you have. Really, really interesting.
And JIAYUE, I think that I'm curious also about the role of proximity, because I do love the sort of spinning cyclical journey through time and things eroding and dissolving, and that idea of this kind of blurred seam where that occurs, and we realize we're seeing two different time frames. But something I think that maybe could be intercut with that and sort of interrupt that circular rhythm would be zooming in on particular items in the scene, so that when we're looking at the bricks decaying and we realize, oh, okay, those are bricks, they've fallen, the narrator even tells us that that's what we're seeing, and it kind of conforms with that. But what I would love is to actually have things that don't really, sort of conform to the same logic. So the narrator might be telling us we're looking at decayed bricks, but then because the camera is pushed in, like really zoomed in, and we might just see the cracks in these bricks, and we might wonder, am I looking at part of a geological formation? Is this part of a mountain range, or is this a building unit, or is this a leaf on a vegetation? Is this an organism? What am I actually looking at? And I think that opportunity is suggested here because of the strangeness of this landscape with the tufa formations that we're seeing here in the background, that those have also kind of, almost like proto-architectural qualities. And then yet we still recognize the architecture very clearly as distinct from those. But I just think the whole way in which the scene, like even taking on the technology you're working with to build the animation, like the fact that everything here is modeled. the tufa is modeled, and so is that building. And so there's no distinction in a way in the digital space. It's all about these models that are sort of representing entities that we think we know. So we're like, oh, that's part of, you know, nature. That's part of architecture. And to me, that's kind of the fascinating thing about working in this medium, is they're all constructs, and they are constructed also according to a similar logic, possibly. So I don't know. I mean, I think that's something you could really take on. And it's here, it's latent, but I think it would involve some other kind of moves with the camera in order to like push us into that space where we start to encounter these uncertainties in terms of the identity of things that we think we know, and we realize that is kind of an unstable definition of what we know. So when is a rock a rock? You know, going back to the stoniness of the stone that many people talk about with the issue of estrangement. I think your project is kind of introducing that territory. So I would commend you on that. I think that, you know, the questions you're raising are really important ones.
And also, I think, you know, it reminds me also of raising that question. It's something that, in a certain way, Piranesi already tried in the Capricci drawings, when he shows, you know, the view of Rome, as he calls it, and really sort of going along the Appian Via, and it's really kind of documenting all the ruins in the way that sort of documents a certain sense of time, civilization, nature taking over, etc. So I think it's really a recurrent theme, I guess, and that, you know, and sort of architecturally speaking, and the way that she is really, you know, sort of forming or creating this project in the kind of complexity of time. The medium is different, the way of the representation, drawing versus film, etc. But I think if I contextualize it that way, I think it really, it adds to me a lot more sort of value, and really it's kind of a, you know, a disciplinary sense of looking at this problem as it has been looked at before in the issue of ruination, and really is you know, how do we place the idea of the ruin at this point or not, as you would say in proto-architecture or the end of architecture. You know, I think there's really sort of really interesting questions that are really presented through this exploration.
But JIAYUE, was that something, I mean, were you thinking about that in the way in which you're using the medium? I mean, maybe you could sort of also repeat this, because you began with the statement, the text, and then that went away quickly and we went into the film, which is amazing. But I maybe you could just say again what that main part of the thesis that you said at the beginning.
So I guess first, so the way I chose to document, well, to choose the medium of this presentation, it's kind of like showing it as a documentary style, so that it works with my thesis that the architecture considers the possibility that undergo formal and material transformations through the lifetime, through the building's lifespan, and it could generate a different existence in each stage of the lifetime of the material and constructions.
That, I mean, because I think, again, this issue of decay, like, is it digital decay or is it environmental? You know, we're thinking about the forces of nature eroding something, but here we're seeing, I mean, you're working with the medium of the film and the digital, you know, so it's almost like the erosion of the pixels. Like what I think is really effective is that blur that you've created. It's almost like a sandstorm when you go out into these kind of landscapes, or even like the atmosphere today in Los Angeles, the dust and the orange haze. And so it is very strange to kind of look at this and see these particles that are representing that environment, but it's actually it's a digital atmosphere. And I think just fully owning that and operating in that territory could be very powerful. And even the tufa might change in your, like, as you move, as you spin through the rotations of the camera, it's like slowly that tufa is changing.
Right.
Yeah.
And I really like how you, to follow on what Marcelyn said earlier, about the materiality. I think you're successful, you know, when in the part that's coming up a little bit, where there's the decomposed wall, and then there's the rust behind it, and then you're seeing these at different sort of moments and different material collapses. I think that it's coming up here on the right. Not this one, but when we get to the crumbled wall, and then there's another wall. See, every time this goes by, I do notice something different, which is, you know, a little disarming, because now suddenly I see another crumbled wall, which was, you know, in the background. But I have to say, you have a very, what I find really is you're calling into attention the viewer's eye, right? How do you look at things? And what does it mean to have that gaze? And what do you see when you see it? And I like that. This is isn't that another, see over here, behind the rust, there is another brick wall that I didn't see until the 10th time. Now, this is, you've got an almost like an archaeologist, you've got the eye of an archaeologist moving through time, and your video is picking up on that same sensibility. But just for me, I find these conditions to be both rich here, where you're seeing time collapse. The bricks have had their own decomposition. The rust is having its own decomposition. And there's a kind of new materiality that's coming out of that. I find that to be the interesting moments. And I think what brought that to my mind is what Marcelyn was saying earlier, is why not change the scale? Is there another technique or another gaze that pauses and looks at something, you know, to reveal the texture, or to reveal, you know, the other gaze, another kind of gaze.
Would you say, I mean, as architects, so would your, you know, I don't know if there's an overt kind of message that you would like to convey, but this project is sort of demonstrating, as Hina pointed out, it's kind of almost like a reverse archaeology or something. You know, we're sort of seeing things that have decayed, but we're seeing into the future, a future that doesn't yet exist, and you're presenting us with a history. So I think it's a great vehicle for ways of inscribing history and sort of even maybe situated histories into an architectural project without having to say, okay, there's this sort of like statement that sits outside and then there's the design work, but it's like that history is kind of built in to the storytelling that you're doing. And I wonder, like, would you say that this is a project that's intended to make us think differently about how we operate as architects by looking into this, you know, projected future? Is it something that is kind of almost like an activator, something that should make us think about how we're designing today?
Yeah, I would say definitely. In a way, it's kind of like suggesting that we design not just for today, but also for the future. So the architecture could kind of document the history of the building itself, and also it could not, so it goes beyond the human life, I guess. It's kind of what I think it's suggesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to see a project right now that is, I guess, like looking at such this like kind of like long experience against the kind of backdrop that we're in, where everything seems to be radically catastrophic from day to day. Like you're kind of purposefully taking this more distant meditative look at you know, how kind of entropy occurs at this other rate, this kind of less interventionist rate than the project. And I think that's a really nice and interesting kind of alternative perspective to our current, like every morning a new terrifying cataclysmic piece of event seems to be shaping our world. Since we got started a little bit early, maybe we can, if there are any like closing comments, and then I think REZA is also ready to go the next project.
I just have one thing to say, and it's just I kind of kept quiet because I think, Joe, you've heard me talk enough over the summer. But I just wanted to say congratulations, and I thought that everything, all of the comments were spot on. A lot of the things that you've been thinking about, a lot of the things that are kind of like subtly in here, but a little bit hidden, or some things that you've wanted to kind of develop in this. That I think I think each of the comments have kind of hit on exactly. And so just in general, I just want to say congratulations and fantastic job.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you, Marcelyn.
Great job. Okay, so next is REZA SALEHI, who is being advised by Marcelyn. Go ahead.
Hi everyone, let me share my screen. Okay. Hi, my name is REZA, and my project is about urban pilgrimage and designing for aggregation of people in this pilgrimage. Yearly, around 22 million Shia Muslims, mostly from Iraq and Iran, participate in the Arbaeen pilgrimage and travel from Najaf to Karbala in Iraq to take part in the ceremony which marks the end of the 40 days mourning period for Hussein ibn Ali in Ashura. As we see in these two photos, people come from around the Iraq and Iran, and after actually parking their cars in this space, they start walking from Najaf to Karbala. During the journey, some activities for like morning ceremony and other activities held, and there are some supports for and services for pilgrims during the journey, like food and healthcare. At the end, the pilgrimage will finish in the Karbala in shrine of Imam Hussein. The whole journey is almost flat, and the weather is mostly warm, and in the summer hot. There are no rain during the year. Okay. The relationship between individuals and the aggregation of people in the pilgrimage can be correlated to the bits in a digital system. This project applies this principle of one-to-many to the aggregation of building elements and buildings that form the root of the pilgrimage architecturally. The potential of aggregation to create larger forms is leveraged in this project according to a discrete logic. Forms are amassed through a technique of combining smaller self-similar components that have independent identities. The aggregation of building in the Swan Bazaar is taken as a precedent for the work. The Swan Bazaar comprises an architecturally significant route in which its components maintain their own identity, while simultaneously the interaction of these constituents produce a larger semi-coherent form. The Caravanserai is another precedent for the project. The Caravanserai program is a place where travelers gather for a short time during a journey. The Caravanserai provide a platform for interactions between different people with different cultural contexts. These precedents provide the quality of the space that are designed in order to encourage pilgrims to share their experiences. Calligraphy has a long and rich history in Islamic art and architecture. Some forms have used just for writing, and some of them have used in two different ways in architecture: ornamental way and tectonic way. For this project, I choose a kind of calligraphy form that has been used for architecture in the history. Its name is Kufi. I choose some sentences, and after extraction of some parts, I try to make new languages by curving of original forms. In the next step, with software tools and strategies like extrusions and booleans, these forms have made. At the end of these phases, with combining the forms based off the discrete logic, I made these complex forms. Okay. For facade system, there is another precedent from the history. Jalis, or in English word jali, is a lighting system that make these kind of shadows and light patterns. Here you see the study model for making a screen as a facade system, and studies with lighting to check the quality of shadows. At the end, this facade system designed for the forms. Program diagram contain bathroom, public dining room, healthcare, cultural center, mosque, and sleeping room. On the map, you see the whole journey, start point in Najaf and the end point in Karbala. Every 15 miles, after around 6 to 7 hours walking, there is one of those centers, those complex forms, that you can see as a number 1 and number 2 on the right side. Between them, there are some smaller centers for supporting pilgrims with services which they needed. Also, rectangular forms are a kind of bridge that give pilgrims a different point of view, from the upper level to the aggregation of people and pilgrims. Forms that are placed during the journey and at the end. When the centers are full of people and pilgrims, pilgrims during journey, that carrying flags, serving foods, lighting candles as a ceremony, and at the end, my final model and the quality of shadows and lighting inside of the model. In the summary, this thesis works with the discrete logic of masses that derived from calligraphy and using the Jalis forms for designing the facade system. That is also discrete these beats. Aggregation of these beats starts to both mask all masses and in the same time also uncovers. Like we get a moment for the revealed and the moments where there is the sense of mystery. Thank you.
Great. Maybe you could just kind of periodically move through the presentation while we begin comments.
Reza, maybe you mentioned this. I might have missed it. Is with the color, with the patches of color, is that tied to anything, or is it just part of the design?
Actually, it's different. It can represent different, maybe the story of this pilgrimage. Different people with different cultural contexts come together and make a unity. And another thing is based on discrete logic, these beads with different colors that maintain their own identity and at the end together make another bigger forms and bigger new forms.
Reza, you very carefully took us through the precedents for your thinking on light, and also your formal manipulations of calligraphy, which was very interesting to see. Was just to clarify, was color part of that? Because it becomes a very prominent part of your solution, no? I mean, on a very long, arduous, symbolic pathway, these are going to have a presence, right? That are of another time, almost, thinking of, I mean, the way that you are bringing together primary colors, for example, whereas some of your precedents has more to do with singularity of color, right? When you're looking at the calligraphy, mostly blue, there's a very much focused on not so much the word itself, but the image of the word, right? So here you've got this cacophony of primary colors. It's got a, that also has a new materiality on this very monochromatic topography and path. And so can you talk a little bit about, I mean, you made those decisions and it became part of your process. So I would love to sort of see if it's a juxtaposition of, history versus, I don't want to put words in your mouth more. I want to sort of hear your thoughts on this and the direction it took.
Actually, let me be honest about the colors. Some part is because of the have these have different colors with different qualities, and some part is because of some technical limitation for making the model. But I don't want to say it's because of these limitation, because having different colors that represent different identities and different cultural contexts was my target to use these kind of colors.
I think there's a lot of things that I really like about your project. I think I like this juxtaposition between the screen and let's say the scripted forms underneath, and what they suggest in terms of maybe who's building them and how they come together. And so the screen, it's a simple enough form. It's like basically a donut that I could imagine could be an aggregation that it accumulates over time by the millions upon millions of people that go on this pilgrimage, right?
Yeah.
And that they each come, they kind of have, I don't know, they have their own color or their own sort of pattern or whatever. It kind of builds up over time. And so it's like a simple tectonic assembly system, right? You just kind of piece by piece. Whereas like the more scripted forms underneath begin to suggest something that requires, let's say, much more focused areas because it's dependent on a higher degree of let's say craft or construction, right? So there's the necessity to build formwork, to build like all of the sort of layers of things to get some of these curves, to get the complex sort of formwork that's around there. And I love that juxtaposition between the two, and then how I think looking at some of your images, the one thing that I do wish is that we could see the cover being a little bit more expansive across the field of where, like, almost as if in one of those first slides where you're showing like all of the little dots of people in the aggregations, if that became entirely the cover. And then it's only in the moments where you get these sort of dense aggregations that we start to see the more, so let's say scripted, I don't know, Boolean, whatever form buildings that are kind of locating specific moments in that journey across. But I do like that, and I think one thing that I've always sorry, this is long. One thing I've always wondered with you, and if I remember this right, from having you as a student years ago, is that you used to work in painting restoration. And I'm just curious as to whether or not, like, the way in which you're using these colors and you're aggregating these colors has anything kind of relating back to that the way that you might restore a painting.
For me, always working with colors was an interesting thing, and mixing them together to represent a new quality always is interesting for me. You're right about that. And another thing that I should mention is representing of the quality of pilgrimage, that they are, as you can see, a part of this on this picture and this photo collage. They are carrying different flags with different colors, and when you see the whole journey, you can recognize these different group from each other, and when they are mixed together, they make a big and bigger unity.
I think your response about color and multiculturalism is a good one. I mean, this is gathering people from all over the Middle East, and you know, there's a even looking at this image, right? There are people from all over and all colors, and I think that your the argument that you made is a good one. Can you go back through these slides?
Yes.
There's another, I like very much the series of studies in calligraphy. I'm a huge fan of, yeah, some of these. And then if you go forward, there's some three-dimensional moves that you made. After this, if you go through, I think there's a couple of these, yeah? This kind of scalar breaks, and then these, I think there are a few more. Did you introduce, yeah, I think some of these are quite nice. This series is very nice. Can you go forward?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, yeah. So I see immense potential, and I like these too. This almost has a new city-like formation to it. You know, it really is spatially and otherwise. I like the intricacy of it. So all to say that I think that the calligraphy studies I find to be very compelling, spatially and object-wise. But the one thing I would have wished for, or there's an opportunity for, is they remain as objects in a way, right? That they remain as these very solid, almost monumental pieces, particularly when we see them in juxtaposition to the smaller scale of the screen. And given the, you know, what you have here promises to be like if you were to see a screen around this, but I think you left it behind, and then you began to sort of curate out of this and begin to make those with the screen so that they became more, I should say, like pavilion-like, right? Here, yes. But the calligraphy part of it here, I really like where the calligraphy also takes on some of the color. So the juxtaposition of the screen to the script becomes ambiguous. And I think that's a really lovely moment. And then the screen loses all color, and all color is then embedded into the script, into the calligraphy on the inside. The next step for me would be, though, just imagine all these millions of people using these spaces, right? You've got, what does this give you? It gives you moments of privacy. It gives you moments of thought along this very, you know, processional experience, which takes days and days and days. So there are these moments of contemplation, there are these moments of rest, there's these moments of various other activities. But that at the moment, I think, is a little unclear, right? In terms of what, and I think it can be developed. I mean, certainly you've set it up where from here, those moments can be curated, right? In terms of what are you giving back to this performance rather than, I mean, right now you sort of have these very solid maze-like pieces, but the inhabitability, the spatiality, the scale, I think has not been looked at so carefully as you move from the sort of scaleless calligraphy studies to now finding a home and a scale and a geometry and a real scale on this momentous pathway. So I think that for me would be the next step that I think would be very, very, very productive.
I agree to that. I mean, I think I like the project a lot, and there's moments where you're still in the calligraphy and then you start kind of creating the formations of what I would say is kind of, you know, sort of you sort of present all the pieces together, this collective of objects, right? And, you know, there could have been one moment, which is, you know, the thought of maybe there was idea, should I make the calligraphy the buildings themselves? In other ways, sort of start sort of inhabiting those things. But I think it was a really smart move to think, okay, so they're going to be like these sort of objects inside these figures, this kind of three-dimensional poche, which is really sort of what it sort of becomes, right? And then the beautiful screen comes around, which I think is really a very sort of accurate move. But I agree that there is really, there are all these pieces there, which is really ways to sort of inhabit those, so people really, you know, sort of climbing on top of that or sitting on top of that, or really how there's choreographed in that relationship, what really happens inside. So in a way, there's another way to look at the project that is really from the inside out. So it's really, everything has been treated from the outside, to me, as a lot of Islamic architecture is really how it's seen, you know, how it's perceived from the inside, not only through the sort of the effects of the light onto the color, but also how people sort of gather inside these places. And I think that kind of study, that kind of activation would have been really terrific to really fully understand the project from the impact, that is the beautiful impact from the inside, and also how people deal with it from the inside, like events like this one, right? Sort of maybe there's a place where they serve food, or you know, all kinds of things. So I think that's really the part also that I'm sort of missing. Other than that, I think the project's really beautiful.
Thank you.
I'm a little curious about a moment. Can you go back a few slides to maybe the first time that you aggregated the calligraphy? I think it's a bit higher.
This one.
Next one. The kind of the down. Sorry.
Oh.
You have a couple of 3D assemblies, and they start to get more complex until the ones with the dark gray background. Yeah. Keep going. Next. This one. I mean, I find this one really interesting when we start to think about some kind of campus that's emerging that has this kind of variated moments for different event within a single location. And I'm also kind of curious how something like this, what kind of logics would have emerged if you had attempted to create the same kind of screen to part language in this one as you did in the kind of the next series of iterations, where it feels like you intensely wanted to kind of modularize, in some ways, the formal footprint of those parts, right, into kind of simpler building components, where the screen in a lot of ways kind of ossifies the complexity of these sorts of assemblages into something like more repetitive, right? Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, you're right. And this creating of these forms give me a variety of opportunity to make different spaces and different complex models with some limited forms. For example, with 10 of these, I can make a lot of bigger forms. I can play with them and discrete them, like something that we do usually in calligraphy. We use different forms of the alphabets with different forms of words, especially in Arabic and Farsi alphabet. We play with them to make new, bigger forms.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that I like in these two images I find very latent in them. It feels like these are paragraphs, you know, or like these are moments of assembly where I lose the individual character relative to the overall content of the, I don't know, paragraph is, I don't want to say paragraph twice, but I'm out of vocabulary. So building paragraph, whatever thing. In a way that I think your later ones, I think you, by kind of skinning the kind of character chunks individually, maybe you undermine that a little bit. Like I start to read it more of like if this is a kind of calligraphy which kind of continues together from character to character, and this kind of, you know, at a certain point each character becomes a continuation to the next one and it produces something other. If you go forward a couple more slides, maybe like this, right? So at a certain point you move into these two languages. The next slide is probably good too. And I think in this case, a little bit of that kind of quality from the kind of analog of the calligraphy starts to kind of get eroded a little bit or undermined through the way that these now become almost like, I almost see these as like in a typesetter or like a printing press, right? They're kind of these blocks whose components, you know, no longer really produce something collective in the same way. And not to say they don't produce anything collective. I think that there's still, the way the patterns on the skin are moving together is quite nice, but the internal characters don't contribute to a kind of more complex and differentiated space in the way that earlier paragraph did. And I think it's because of that move from the early one feels like calligraphy and this one feels more like maybe typesetting. Like, but I think one thing that is may be difficult to tell is that, and I think this is a difficult thing to represent, right, is that this is a project that's covering like an immense spatial distance, right? And maybe there's a beneficial effect to having these kind of more punctuated forms along that route rather than the more kind of complex one. I'm not sure like how you feel about that, but there is a certain sense of kind of modularity or trying to think of like a word that doesn't seem pejorative in any way, but like, you know, it's like when you drive out of the desert, it does, you know, the gas stations become all the same, right? Yeah. They're this single like kind of prefabricated system that just gets deployed along the highway every 60 miles or so. And so I feel like the project starts to participate more in that language, at least in terms of its formal sense along this kind of progression, and that these are kind of these punctuating elements of repetition, rather than, I think in the earlier formal study, it had the opportunity of being something which is starts to become, you know, like from a paragraph to a narrative as these kind of complex spatial configurations begin to evolve along the progression along the trail. I think that's a difficult thing to represent, but that might be an interesting thing for you to start to, or maybe you would want to experiment with, like, you know, it's the worst thing to do during a thesis to say like, hey, you should try to do this drawing now that you've graduated from school, right? But I think that there's some layer of representation for your project that would be really interesting to pursue, and that is that how do you identify, or how do you represent the event of these elements across that length of the pilgrimage, like not just as a drawing, but as a way of trying to understand the kind of temporality and the sequence of events and the way that these things become markers along this territory.
Thank you. It was a really interesting idea that I can develop it in the future. Yeah. Thank you.
I have a last question. But did you ever consider thinking about the ground? So not only, you know, the calligraphy inside and the envelope, but did you ever consider that the ground could have some of the prints itself?
Maybe it's better I say, as I said, the whole journey is in a flat ground. Not many special study about that. Just I have this one.
REZA, I'm kind of left with a lot of questions, and kind of going between, you know, how I think about the architecture as proposed, but also kind of there's a clear avoidance, and that might be very willful, but in terms of how it avoids maybe pressures, conflicts that might live in this, let's say, assembly of cultures in terms of politics, and how it's impossible to avoid it. You know, I'm wondering, very carefully kind of avoided talking, I mean, maybe that's not the right way of putting it. You haven't talked whether this organization has suggested, this new architecture, it's clearly different than what it's there, and that's perfectly fine. Whether it reorganizes the status quo when it comes to this event, whether it begins to define new forms of engagement between constituents that are subject to certain bias, you know, because there are rules dictated on them. We are talking about cultures that are, you know, certain parts of the cultures are free to express more than others. Whether the architecture you're proposing is dealing with questions or trying to kind of really stay clear. Are you trying to engage a highly charged political, religious condition in a political way? Or is there a hidden agenda per se? And I'm perfectly happy to kind of talk about that. Whether you think the role of the architect here is to engage it as smoothly as possible, but with an agenda that deals with those in the background. I think it's impossible not to talk about these issues within a project like this. Sorry for the background. Within a project like this, where you're engaging a very specific activity of pilgrimage within a very particular constituents of a very large religion.
If I understand your question right, I try to have a new organization and new forms, but not completely different with what there is there. Why I'm saying not completely different? Because of the quality of caravanserai that we have, and I try to represent it, and the quality of the spaces that there are. Also, I try to produce all of these new forms based on a historical and something that completely people of that regime are familiar with them. I thought producing these new forms based on something like calligraphy and something like quality of spaces like caravanserai can be more friendly for people that live in that area.
I love the optimism in your voice, and I think that's the right attitude to have. What I'm wondering then aesthetically is whether kind of the aspiration to operate through the familiar is abstracted to a point, either through calligraphy or implementation of color, that the familiar becomes so far removed, and this becomes kind of a purely novel condition that's now represented. Now, it's really interesting to me, mosques of Isfahan, Shiraz, the Muqarnas, they're all kind of super important for me, precedents that always show with regards to colors, estrangement of geometry, and of course, the kind of the reason for that is the way they're, I think, so impressive in terms of geometric order, that there is kind of a ban in Islam in terms of figural representation, right? Like the history of Islamic art, that because it could not represent human figure, we kind of worked through abstraction of geometry.
Exactly.
And there's a little bit of a polemic in your project in that sense, because you literally take the calligraphy and re-represent figuratively the calligraphy as architecture. I have zero problem with that. I think it produces really interesting results, and I think everybody is kind of pointing to the qualities that you've been able to produce. But I'm wondering that question of the familiar, if one looks at the kind of articulated mosque surfaces, the muqarnas, the operation of geometry and color on the surfaces, and the kind of, maybe in return, the muted quality of the exteriors in terms of expression, because you could say like interiors are just maybe 10,000 more times charged than the outsides. And they're just other worlds. They're kind of unreal in many aspects, either reflectivity of materiality, saturation of color, things that really intensify an interior experience. And I'm wondering, again, maybe pointing back to that question, I don't have a kind of conclusion in my hand, just throwing it back to you. whether the use of color and separation of articulation ornaments from the surface of the calligraphy kind of driven formal work helps you in your quest to produce a familiar experience, or pushes to an extreme of kind of exotic and novel and new in the context of where you're operating. It detaches from that aspiration. And I'm kind of lost somewhere in between. I think in images where I can feel the atmosphere of the color reflected on the surface with the light, I'm compelled. Other moments where I see it from outside, I am less so. And I'm wondering, which direction this could push.
Yeah, maybe this difference just is because of the difference between photography of the models and the representation of colors in software with rendering. Maybe, but honestly, in the real world, I'm more agree with these phasey quality that we can see in this render.
Just okay. Sorry, were you going to say something, Mathew?
Oh, no, please go ahead.
I just want to pick up on what Kutan was saying a little bit, Reza, because if you go back to some of your precedent images and look, the location of the calligraphy, I mean, and Kutan, even when you go into the Hagia Sophia or the Blue Mosque, or, I remember going in, I mean, I read Arabic, and I remember being with someone who said, can you read it? Because it has been written in such a place where it's not meant to be read, right? It's so far up, or it becomes enmeshed with decoration, or it becomes enmeshed with pattern, or it becomes enmeshed with color. So although Reza has really zoomed in on that calligraphy, usually these are at really elevated locations. So it's not about being able to read it. That is not the case, but I'm curious about this idea of politicizing, or that is there something here that is being politicized, because now you are abstracting it, you're inhabiting it, whereas before it was about the image of the word. Now it is about the inhabitation of that potency that one could imagine in some, I mean, this is probably religious text, right? I mean, if you took these from these locations, this is a holy word. So right here is where, Reza, I would say you are being, I don't think you can I agree with Kutan in saying that you can't really hide behind this sheet where you're saying, no, it's all about geometry. It's really all about geometry. And it's really about this process that I took it through, which then I now inhabit. I think there's something there that you can mine, right? Because this is it doesn't need that, by virtue of bringing that word, this very embedded word, and bringing it down and being able to, even though I still go back to my first point, which is that what is that inhabitation look like? But I think that there is and what is it? I don't think it's about cooking, and I don't think it's about just walking through with stuff. I think that there is something there that can participate in this sort of new juxtaposition that you brought into play, that I don't think you can just leave it here. But I do agree that there is, it is a political, maybe it's not political, but it is certainly an act to be able to take that down from a place where it's not read as text, now bringing it to the ground where it's still not read as text, but now what role does it play? It sort of comes back to my earlier point, and I think to leave it is missing a sort of statement that you could make.
I'm totally agree with you. I cannot say that choosing sentences was not important to me, and even the meaning of them was important for me when I was choosing them. But maybe I can say it was in this project, I tried to have my distance from the religious part, and I want to say I didn't wanted to represent the just religious parts and just cultural parts. I wanted to be more I wanted to pay attention to the form of the language and be consider about the formative forms too. I hope I could transfer my idea.
It's funny, REZA, in the image that you kept hovering over, the collage, with all of the people in it. Oh, go back up. That one in the center. Next one below it. So, I mean, I think there's, in the way that some of your representation is signaling other things, I think that that's also part of one of the reasons why maybe there's an interpretation of politics in the project, right? And with this image, and you know, this is the absolutely wrong thing to overlay onto it, but in my initial sort of seeing of this image that you have on here, like the very first sort of, and I'm sure like the other people in with a sort of strong awareness of architectural history would also kind of respond in this way, is that the initial when I looked at this image, the first thing I thought of was the famous collage of the Casa de Fascia, where, you know, the crowd is kind of looking to the architecture. But in the more that I looked at this image and the more that you kind of held it onto the screen, the more that I started to see a lot of, let's say, important nuance and difference between that. One, the crowd is not looking at the architecture, they're actually looking off at the lower corner at something else, and we don't really know what that is. The buildings that you've designed, as you've kind of stated before, it's not while it is sort of clustered and grouped, it's not identifying a sort of centralized monument, but instead it's the edges are bleeding into one another. They're like kind of very diffuse, and so it's really, really hard to pinpoint where the building kind of begins or ends. I mean, we can kind of see it on the oblique when it kind of sharpens a little bit, but then when we look at it directly on, as you kind of pointed out, where the color overlays on top of the scripted forms, that the edges become much more, let's say, hazier, blurrier, and the colors do as well, right? You start to produce other sort of forms of color, and I think that might be an important aspect to this, the sort of way in which that this architecture that you're building that is aggregating is not necessarily creating monuments, but it's as diffuse as the crowd that's also gathering in the interior. And that it's constantly kind of shifting attention around itself, right? So instead of like focusing on one area, it's shifting to a corner, to another edge, to a sort of moment where things get really kind of muddy and blurry, and it becomes as like, let's say, equally complex as the people that are in the center of this image itself. And I think that's kind of it's a really nice image. Like if you were to just present your project with only like 3 images, right? I think that you could probably, you could take these and you can kind of focus like an entire conversation just about those, about a very few things.
Thank you, Mathew. Thank you for your.
I think you know, one of the things that I find, I mean, I was hesitant myself to talk about the political part, although I was thinking about it, because you know some articles that I've read before, I don't remember correctly, but there were some issues that happened politically speaking in one of the last celebrations of this pilgrimage. So there's really a really intense, very tense political situation happening, you know, especially during this time, right? So I felt in a way that you were, in a sense, avoiding the issue, where, in a sense, mildly presenting it. So when it was brought again to the table, I was happy, because I think there is really a way to explain the project in very precise ways. The one is really the architectural part, which deals with, and I agree that's a really interesting move to kind of bring down the calligraphy and take it into another realm, so to speak. But at the same time, I think the political implications of what does this project can do or provide culturally and politically in that kind of context is actually really important. So maybe the way to begin to explain a little bit of the project versus the process of the generation of the forms, etc., it really has to do with that political context of what it does, right? Because it really seems at the core of it, when we look at it, is really way deeper than what is presented, because it gets the impression that is really, well, the cultural resolution of the project is really given by colors and things like that, right? Which seems sort of a mild way or to present the project. But I think, you know, it's been sort of, as you explore the project, there's really more to it that could have been sort of surfaced more and argue it in a much more sort of a cultural context in the relationship, how space is working has been suggested, interior and exterior, looking at the building, but also what does it mean when something like this is happening, you know, and the pilgrimage of that through it. So I think there's that kind of connection that I understand you have your reasons to sort of be kind of cautious about it, but at the same time, I think there's really, to me, I was looking for that kind of polemic. I'm not really sort of, you know, I don't know enough about, you know, Islamic architecture or this political situation, but I know that there's really something much more provocative to begin to bring to the table, especially in this kind of forum, which would ignite sort of an interesting conversation of this relationship, right?
Yeah. Actually, I was trying to be away from the political things about the projects, but I'm totally fine with it, especially when you bring this subject. Something that was completely, let me say this now, that our dialogue goes to there. Something that was completely important for me about this pilgrimage was the different point of view that I or others in that area have about something like this pilgrimage, with the point of view that people in the West has about it. Because we participate in this pilgrimage, but people in other places just receive some news about that, or receive the pictures and photos from through the lens of the cameras, that these cameras belong to others. For me, something that was completely interesting about this pilgrimage was participation of Iranis and Iraqis people in this pilgrimage. People that were in a war for 8 years together. But after that war, they are yearly participate in this pilgrimage, and people in Iraq host the people, 3 million people from Iran every year. And they are completely holding this pilgrimage together. So for sure, this part of the story was important for me, but I try to be away from that just in architectural way.
I'm really happy with this conversation, Reza, because I think that it sort of takes us back to the point of departure, because I know you were kind of talking about this all semester, like how much of the political and overtly religious context that you adhere to and how much you take that on. And I think some of the comments, the provocation of Kutan and Hina's discussion of bringing that which was sort of sacred to the mundane, I think that's really amazing to think about the implications of that and what that could mean, and the kind of maybe stealthy quality that could exist in the project, that, the same discussion that we are having about whether we're reading text or looking at text, how we look at text, how our body has to be oriented in space to even read that text, that your project, I would encourage you going forward. I think it's been a really pivotal conversation for you to have as you graduate from SCI-Arc, is to think about, as an architect, that one doesn't have to steer away from those things, but one can actually engage them architecturally, formally, through the use of color, so that these things are not opposed. It's not that there is like a political stance and then there's architecture. These things actually dialogue. And I think, right now there are a lot of discussions about how that occurs. And so I really want to thank our critics for bringing that to the table, because it's really something you need to address. But I think we're actually now out of time. We have a short break, I believe. Is that right, Casey?
Yes, there's a 5-minute break until 3:50.
Okay, so I just want to congratulate you, REZA, because I know you've done an enormous amount of work. There were hundreds of these studies of calligraphy. So thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Great job.
Congratulations, Reza.
Good job, beautiful.
Thank you.
So as Marcelyn mentioned, we have scheduled a 5-minute break if you guys need to do whatever you want for 5 minutes, and then we're going to get started at 3:50 with Lawrence Yu. Sound good?
Hi, Lawrence.
Hello.
No. Casey, how are you?
Great. Yeah, I'm doing pretty good. It's a little weird in California right now, but good.
Yes, it seems like it's really scary.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know if I'll turn off my screen for a second. I don't know if you can tell, but like my apartment is just like orange right now.
Gosh.
No, it looks normal on the webcam. So just imagine without the color correction on the webcam that my apartment was orange.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Great. We'll just wait a few more moments for the rest of the jury to join up. Mhm. Kutan, are you in 2001? Oh.
Can't do 2020, man.
Nice.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so it looks like we have everybody here, and some others might be coming in and out. So we're going to kick off the second set of students with Lawrence YUAN, who is one of my students. Go for it.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lawrence. Let me share my. Okay. I'll be presenting through the video with the recorded voiceover. And then my thesis is called Data Navigator and the Alienation. Okay.
Lawrence, should there be sound on the video?
Yeah.
Oh, can you make sure that you shared your computer sound when you shared?
Sure. Oh, sorry. Let me see. Okay. Can you guys hear
Today, our bodies and social behaviors are
Good?
Yeah, just go ahead and restart it.
Okay,
That's good.
sorry. Okay.
Today, our bodies and social behaviors are penetrated by numbers. We are abstracted into data clusters on digital platforms to participate in social, economic, and political activities. When big data and cloud computing become the dominant rules, our control and knowledge over the digital environment are undermined. This digital alienation is the product of unequal power structures that intentionally deny users control, and this manipulation fits Marx's definition of alienation as an estranged power system working against individuals. Thus, this thesis proposes an alternative solution that passes the value back to users, by leveraging the data in the unknowably large digital space, in order to respond against the objective conditions of non-control and non-ownership. Also, establishing a tool that allows architects and designers to intuitively navigate digital contents and utilize the latent space of neural networks, which is composed of the contributions of architectural designs from the internet and social media, to manipulate the outputs of alienated labor towards their design intentions. The internet has become the tool of alienation. The investment of digital labor users put online has been alienated from them with little return, and the digital content being used without understanding the production has also alienated users by weakening their control over it. So this thesis is developing a tool that aims to answer back these situations through getting inside the alienated labor and collecting architectural social media contents to build new value for users. The solution, yet, cannot be an attempt to return the loss of authenticity, if we recognize the fact that the current model of precedence sourcing is flat, which is users assimilating content only depends on images. However, it rather could be an opportunity of acknowledging the depth that can exist in the flatness, which is making what has been flattened into alienated products available back to users, through intensifying the process of extracting aesthetic features from precedence. So, this proposed new model creates a search-based feedback loop for open sources which feeds outputs in as inputs in order to continuously update and mutate with new content. And also this platform uses AI systems to utilize the entire internet as its dataset, is not about generating unique AI aesthetics but to better accumulate the vast resources of online labor. To further optimize the production of this platform, we are using a neural network style GAN for producing higher resolution images, aggregating features from a wide range of sources, and constantly updating the dataset with online content. To operate this platform, the first step is to feed images in, and the AI will analyze theses inputs images and find the closest ones that can be produced by itself from its dataset, which is the entire internet. Users can feed any intended images directly into the platform, and adjust the projected results accuracies between input and output to steer the neural network. For instance, here we use an office building image as an input, and we use the slider to control the projected results until we are happy with them, and then add another image trying to mix them in the next step, where users can blend the projected results between two inputs or more, to compose a new image with the aesthetic characteristics inherited from the original images. So we start to engage those embedded qualities such as the curtain wall or the crowded apartment buildings, in order to produce hybrid imagery and to evolve the features into new ones. Next, this platform works with another system called MonoDepth, that can generate depth maps automatically for the images. Then the platform uses depth maps to evaluate points' three-dimensional positions, and create a series of faces to make point cloud compositions from maps. Here we begin to translate the digital labor from 2D images to three-dimensional objects, where a lot of the features created in this platform could be further explored as space or form. This idea of intuitively working with digital alienated labor is to explore the potential of incorporating automated design techniques with digital resources that we've lost control of. So we've even pushed this further to allow users to utilize this workflow with online content that seem irrelevant to architecture. For instance, they can generate architectural forms with any input, from pictures of Gothic churches and contemporary office buildings, to even a photo of chicken sandwich. Like here we blend the previous hybrid building image with a new projected sandwich architecture image, and pick position 30 as the result to generate depth maps, where we increase the value of the middle area to make the curtain wall part stand out more, and to have a contrast in the geometry. This suggests a new way of designing architecture, through having access to all kinds of digital content based on aesthetics, and being able to exploit them to create architectural forms. Users can easily generate a lot of design options with this automated workflow, run through the process to generate a catalog of objects. and bring them outside of the platform to architecturalize them into building level forms, integrating the process with other platforms to further develop the products. Starting by thickening and penalizing the faces, we begin to turn the products into building chunks that have facade systems and basic structures, and shaping the interior space through interpreting different layers of faces into walls. The features of geometries from the objects are adapted into building elements, the apertures on the protrusion parts are translated into windows, creating a contrast between the interior and heavy walls. The exterior wall was created with higher depth values which result in a landscape-like geometry, whereas the lower value of the interior creates faces with hard edges.
Yeah, that's all about my presentation.
Great. Could you just go ahead and loop that full screen?
Yeah.
Thanks.
So,
Oh, Hernan's muted, I think. Hernan?
I think you can go,
So-
Gabe.
Yeah, so I mean, I really like the project. I think it's really, sort of very interesting because it really, at the core of it, is really giving architects no agency. And I think that's, to me, the premise is really, what really the second digital turn is about, the kind of liberation from the kind of chains or the way that the digital information and the internet is really sort of manipulating the situation by being owned by other people, et cetera. So then that the kind of exploration of that, the hacking of that system, whatever is really truly important to really sort of embrace the new digital age. I think that's critical. Also, I think there's what's critical about what is really interesting about this. It really is the development of the process, not so much because a lot of the AI training, et cetera, is really based just kind of style GANs and kind of training, learning how to train that in runway or things like that, and then really just kind of manipulating only the kind of 2D or the image itself, right? But then this is really this application that starts to really work more on a process that really, which is the most difficult part, to go from 2D to 3D, and really sort of trying to explore that as a kind of method of agency, but also as a part of a development into the actual sort of studio itself. I think that's really critical. And the other part about the process I really like is the kind of what you call the penalizing the faces in a way, because I think that kind of begins to remove some of the problems that you have when you work 2D, 3D, and the difficulties of that workflow. And by sort of then the combining of the certain sense of, human intelligence with AI, et cetera, it's kind of, in a sense, kind of in a way domesticating or really kind of negotiating with the product from the AI, and your expertise is really critical in the combination of that. And I think that's the way they sort of begin to give agency to, or reclaim that agency in relationship to our present condition. So, it's something I'm really interested in, whatever. So I really understand a lot of the effort that it takes to do this. So congratulations. I think the project is really fantastic.
Thank you.
I'm interested. It's an interesting project. I'm maybe a little bit less convinced about the sort of idea that this can be a sort of liberating project, the sort of Marxist overlay on it. But instead, I would actually look at the ways in which, and I think maybe looking at a lot of the current politics, even just like net neutrality and the way that, let's say, things are actually still able to control the sharing of data and the rates that data is actually shared, and maybe works against your project. But maybe one thing to look at then is to look at AI in the opposite way. In where would, in the way that you've set this up, what would be the ways in which like this would be instead not necessarily a fully shareable resource, but instead would be how would it inevitably be controlled? And I think for me, I think the answer to that is perhaps in resolution. And that even as we're kind of looking through some of your images, that the sort of, I mean, there's the baseline issue of the images or the constructions of them needing a certain resolution in order to get a certain type of building or tectonic sort of construction. But looking at maybe some of the AI softwares that are currently out there and thinking about the way in which value might be constructed through an image construction around resolution would kind of follow that. So if we look at something like gigapixel, right, where gigapixel, it increases resolution per pixel data. And so we can think of it as within any one of your images, the more information or the more details that we might get from it would be the degree to which the platform would be able to subdivide and increase value per pixel. And so I'm wondering whether or not within the system, it's like, where do you see your limits in here? And where do you, like, how do you imagine it being like fully shareable? Because it's like here, as we look at, let's say, once it becomes a sort of three-dimensionalized product, where does it sort of, where does it stop as a sort of being being just a preview and into something that is that could actually be actualized?
Okay. So to the first question, actually, because like due to some constraints around the COVID-19, because the original goal is to like train the data set of on like the like more like all possible, like all images, architectural images downloaded from Flickr, and then so that actually affected the resolution, because it could be like we could like if we had a better if we could like train the data set with like more stuff and like longer, we can have a better we can produce like higher resolutions. So I think that's our initial goal is to, of course, like to make this platform can generate like even higher resolution images, which will, of course, like include like more features and details, you know. So although this guy is not like fully cannot like, you know, didn't like does not show like that part, but I think, yeah, like the resolution did limit some potential here, but the ideal, you know, like the ideal, the original goal is to like try to have like as higher resolution images as possible. And then for the second question of like when does this like stop, and then to bring into other like platform or like to other stage of producing a project, I think that's I think that I didn't want to kind of like, I don't want to kind of like make a very clear boundary for that, because overall this thing, it's a tool. So there's always like a, you know, like a space that when like different people use it, they would probably like use it differently. So some people might think, you know, like this is enough. Others might not. So I think this, although like because I think like the stuff that I'm showing right now is more like an attempt, like as in more like an example, of mine, like follow my own like designing intention. But I won't say that's the, you know, like that's the only way, or that's the only that like that's all this thing can do ideally. Yeah.
You know, I mean, I would say that, you're right in the sense that there's really nothing written and all that. So we're going to use the kind of resolution method as the method to explore AI. I think it's really another way to do it. And it's really sort of, in a way, it's used to kind of prove some ideas, or it's always called proof of reputation, where you start kind of sort of thinking that you can prove two ideas, and it's really more about sort of testing the process, in itself, right? So that's really how I understand that idea of resolution. So in a sense, it's not exclusive to any of that. I think it's really a way to evaluate the ideas. And that method, as you mentioned it can really start kind of sort of negating that one direction or one goal is, is not really what you thought it could be, and you start kind of moving in another direction. So I guess, the resolution method can help as an evaluator of the process itself that can be sort of applied at any time. So I agree with that. I think is also included, I guess, in the evaluation of it in one sense or another. I don't know exactly what's really sort of included here as part of that, but I think it's really a way to look at it.
Lawrence, I think something that your project brings up that's very provocative is the part where you're talking about how you add detail, which is fascinating to me, that with a given resolution, that working with the style GAN, and then sort of projecting new architectural details into the world from things. I mean, I was fascinated by the chicken sandwich. I love that one, where it's sort of like the thing that might be, almost like batter fried chicken suddenly becomes rustication. And in a way, I ask myself, like, why do I read it? Like, suddenly I start to see the yield here as being a building that is kind of rusticated, like Palazzo Rucellai. And so I project onto this matter something that, I'm familiar with, and I try to architecturalize it. And I think that is sort of fascinating. There, yeah, this one on the right, it starts to, it's pretty amazing in the center here. And the idea that it's batter fried chicken. And so the identity shift that's occurring there, and the way in which, as a human, I start to look at this material and project those kind of almost classifications onto it, I think is really powerful. And it really does raise questions about what is the threshold of the architectural detail versus some other forms of matter. And at what point we, the conventional tools we use to design and control matter as architects, it's like sort of a different game when that is this almost digital matter. So I actually really appreciate that aspect of the project very much. I think it's great.
Thank you.
Because I'm wondering, at that junction, let's for a moment forget all the process up to this moment in the slide where we're confronted with something, let's say digital matter, which we then need to kind of operate on and bring to a realm of plausibility, construction, assembly, etc. Why does it matter for you that it comes through this process than any other process? Because one could argue that, I could operate through images of rotten lentil soup to make a project versus a chicken sandwich, or found image of like a garbage pile, or another building, etc. Like the sources could be anything, as long as let's say I developed a sense of intuition, a sensibility through which to extract information, abstract information, and reassemble so that it begins to constitute, quote unquote architecture. And I think we're all kind of open in terms of what the boundaries of that could be. But I'm wondering what are agencies in that process? Because like if agency is tied to a process only, where we either let certain processes dictate and our role within those processes defines our agency, I think we're becoming more and more curators. If we're kind of actively engaged in manipulating curated material, whether they're residue of various processes, at the end which we begin to play architect, which I think is kind of uncomfortable even to say. But I think the question of like where we ended up after your presentation, where you begin to kind of appropriate what you cultivated, what you mined, towards a more plausible assembly. And of course, that's kind of a hard point to get to, and it's where the problems lie in terms of how much we want to vest the agency of architecture in a process and legitimize in it, or the agency architecture is actually something else. Like we do whatever we do in our kitchen in terms of how we make architecture, but the agency is held within the object perhaps, and how we get to that doesn't even matter. So I'm curious, maybe this is a larger discussion, and I don't want it to sound like against AI by any means. I think what you've done is incredibly provocative, but I'm curious, like how does it become normal in some way? How does it become everyday? How does it become a discipline? How does it, I guess, gets disciplined in a way that we can judge it against other narratives of, let's say, discursive productions that we have been through. Especially if you kind of look back in the, somebody mentioned this could be, I think it was Gabe, this could be kind of second evolution of the digital. Like, how is this different than, let's say, the embryonic house, where one had to select one out of, 2,000 frames? How is this different than stopping the scalar animation at some point to decide what is actually the one instance of architecture? Because at some point, we need to produce specification, the specificity of architecture, unless, of course, we're only talking about kind of a digital realm through which we want to mediate architectural code.
I think that's a really interesting point, Kutan. And I think that even though it may be easier to be drawn to the kind of spiky facade chunks at the end, like this part right here was really the emphasis of Lawrence's thesis and what he worked on for the most of the summer. And I think it's actually trying to get at that problem specifically in the difference to like the kind of versioning project. Whereas in like the versioning project, like we could run a random latent walk through the neural network and it would generate a bunch of stuff and we could pick one. Whereas the interface that he's built here, maybe you can go back a little bit to like where you start feeding things in. The idea was there's this kind of vast, unknowable, large space of architectural aesthetic content on Pinterest and Instagram, which our students unethically now use as precedent. And we have to kind of get stressed out that they have no idea who produced these design things or whatever. And this is trying to embrace that by developing a machine which allows a designer to intuitively navigate that space. So like the images at the bottom are things that the architect can feed in to begin to drive the machine, like not to produce like an infinite random number of versions, but to produce like one specific version, right? And we're trying to figure out like what types of interface could be developed that would allow that intuitive like singular authorship back into that kind of vast black box latent space of the neural network. So like rather than generate 1,000 random photos, like this thing is designed to allow you to precisely steer to one specific photo. I think maybe it's undermined a little bit too, because as Lawrence said, like we lost access to our beautiful giant machine. So everything looks a bit blobbed out and gooey rather than the kind of full high-res detail that we were aiming for. But I think that's the aim of the project. And I think that's kind of significantly different than the versioning project of the embryo house.
Yeah, and I also, sorry.
Oh, please go. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to, because I think like the question about like you know, like when should we, like as architectural designers, when should we, like when's the moment that we should start to like take our add our personal you know, like steps. I think as like I think that was I had that question too, like in the beginning, and then like as I like developing this project, I realized that I think it's maybe it's like also shifted, like because so if we, let's say if I start to like design a like a normal project with this platform, like the manipulation, a part of it will shift from because the traditional ways, you know, like it was like sculpting a form or like, you know, like designing the space, but but here it'll be like such as like adjusting the value for these like maybe depth maps, because these will like affect the result, like maybe like how like how extreme these spikes look like, or yeah, like I think I'm not sure if this like answers that question, but I think this is kind of like my my thoughts.
I'm not sure if you're kind of fully escaping authorship. I think the kind of moment of bias shifts, right? Like the moment of bias shifts from actively modeling something, actively making decision on aesthetics, but kind of biases perhaps in the image that you pick, the sequences that you decide, the moment you step. So like in some way, it's always there. I don't know. I personally don't have a problem with that. I think that bias makes subjective outcomes, and for me makes the world varied in ways that I like to enjoy. Like my fear would be that that somehow if we're I guess afraid of that bias, which could manifest itself positively or negatively, right? That we might push the future, you know, where kind of we value other forms of biases even without knowing. And I guess my kind of question here is, how do we discipline this? Can this be disciplined, or can we operate to kind of, let's say, conventions through which we can begin to kind of compare and understand the values? And look, I understand kind of the desire to push such a technique to an extreme to open up potential aesthetics, potential kind of new worlds. How, you know, when this becomes domesticated, when this becomes another convention in our arsenal as architects, because after, let's say, 500 years, we're still doing plans and sections. How does it begin to operate?
I don't know if Kutan is finished or he got frozen.
Yeah, I think I've been falling off. I've been falling off on and off. Sorry, but yeah, I was done there.
Okay, I was just going to say, Lawrence, you know, for me, your argument would make, you know, it's just that last part, that if you had made in your final project you would have, it's almost like a proof of concept, right? so that your final piece, I was just really, you know, I feel like we've come too soon to see that outcome that you have, because I see problematics of design in it, and I see, you know, the stretchiness, the you know, everything that you was trying to study, which was the precision, looking at flatness versus, you know, looking at detail. Whereas that, you know, the part that you show in the middle, where you show density versus flatness, and then there's a new sort of concept of what density and flatness, what the outcome could look like. I was very interested in that. And I think that that's a new way, but there's a learning that has to happen from each of these steps. So where I think you're very successful are the questions that you raise through this. What a great thesis. I mean, I think the questions you raise are very good, which is, and the questions that everyone working in AI is doing, and you have a very probing eye in which to do it. I think that one experiment you made, which also Casey mentioned, where that was something that excited you as well. I'm completely into it. I think that that was a very interesting moment. And sure, okay, if you're looking at food, that's, I'm fine. But there has to be a result that comes out of that, which makes that process worth it, right? Which makes a kind of new outcome, or allows us to look at architecture in a new way, some aspect of architecture in a new way. Marcelyn mentioned detail. Okay, we look at detail in a new way. But I think the pressure that puts on your own project is quite high, because we are looking at no lessons learned from these individual moments and studies that are fantastic. I think your studies are fantastic. But at the end, when I look at that, you know, that chunk which you have, I think it's falling into this. I think here, you know, we don't understand density. We don't understand scale, which you had a really strong handle on. And the questions that you raised remain unanswered at the end, I feel. You know, I mean, this is a wall section that is fine on one side, but we recognize that. But then on the other side, there's this dense materiality which is lacking detail and lacking a kind of, you know, but I don't think you needed, you could have, yes, I understand the problem of the mega computer, but I think you could have gone in there and added your hand and your authorship at that point. I don't think the whole process can and should be automated. And I'm very interested in this, but I'm very interested in the way you were looking at it, which is to get into this with a particular thesis in mind. I think at a certain point it became general, and you're looking for a complete solution out of this process, which is rarely the case in most either you know, experiments that we work with. I'd like to be proven otherwise, but you know, yeah.
I mean, I have, you know, to say, I mean, I agree with some of the moments at the end that, you know, to jump into the resolution and try to kind of present a final view of the project, but it really understanding how hard it is actually to actually get to that point, precipitated or not, you know, it's sort of complex, right? So it really try to domesticate that moment is an attempt to do that. And I think really something, you know, it has to do with, you know, the question that Kutan was asking, which everyone asks that question, saying, okay, so when is the real moment of agency that is really could happen within this process? Or are we just trying to legitimize the idea of the uses or the potential use of AI in terms of architecture, right? And at the end, we sort of always go back to what we know, right? So I think that conjunction of, you know, how do we sort of apply what we know, what we can sort of program or do or understand in that process beyond legitimizing the issue, really finding some kind of agency in that sort of process of domestication, where there is really a role in this case of high definition or low definition in the game that could play. I think that's really the really tough calibration, that it's a conversation in of itself, technically speaking, but also is really connected to a larger issues about design, about, you know, architecture, about all these things. So the conversation, I think, is really starting, and I think is really important to begin to discuss that, because I think there's so many things that like Kimi touched upon. And I think some of the issues that were raised today are provocative enough that really, in my case, really made me think about a lot of other things. So, I mean, the value of this is really the kind of presentation of that as the kind of, well, what can we talk about this, you know, in terms of what he's trying to do. And I think that has been achieved, you know, I think.
No, I mean, I agree. You know, it's kind of interesting to think about the reach of proliferation of the digital into so many different aesthetics over the last 30 years. Minimalists engage digital tools, and people who deal with more complex stuff engage the same digital tools. We engage them differently. And I'd be curious, you know, maybe, you know, Casey, this is, you know, maybe pointed to you, to see whether, you know, technology like this operates only kind of the end of the spectrum of complexity at the far end, or it begins to also experiment alongside with like simplicity. Like, could you put together things that are incredibly simple and produce like just enough of strangeness, enough of maybe novelty that begins to produce new architectural qualities? So like I see this kind of an incredible thing we can all engage. I'm kind of wondering about the range of how we're engaging right now, because almost all examples I've seen are operating kind of, you know, at the limits of what we can process. It'd be kind of really interesting to see for me, like, what if you just use like as little as possible in terms of processing power between two images that has little information in terms of pixel count, and it begins to produce something that we didn't contemplate, you know, in terms of what architecture could do.
And I think, Lawrence, you started with that. You wanted to amplify the flatness, right? And we kind of ended up with the opposite of that. But, you know, flatness implies a simplicity. It implies a kind of, you know, your sources for that might have been different, perhaps. But, I mean, that as a goal was a fantastic goal in terms of how do you amplify flatness? Two very diametrically opposite things that you're bringing together through very different sources. And the outcome from that, I think it's still to be determined. I think you've set up exactly the right process, and that's all what a thesis is about, right? That you set up these provocations and processes, and you ask the right questions, which I think you absolutely have. I would just say stick with it. I mean, because if I follow your, you know, amplifying the flatness, you give very good reasons why, you tell us why we look at certain sources and not others in order to investigate that question and interrogate that question better. But then I think you take a step back, and then I think the chunk is not really, you know, compatible. Or perhaps, you know, the step one would take in order to investigate a new kind of amplified flatness, which is very provocative to me, very. Lawrence, do you want to respond? I'd love to hear, or even Casey. Or reply, I'm curious.
There's lots of, like, yeah, I told Lawrence before this started he was gonna have to answer a lot of hard questions with this project. And since we're kind of closing in on the end, I'm going to go ahead and let Lawrence reply to these, and then we'll move on to the next project. So we'll give you the kind of authorial final word on your own presentation, maybe.
Okay. I think that's a lot of questions, but I think overall, because like, I think for me, like, it's more important to like develop the way to like engage these like you can like relatively new techniques or idea, because I know because we started actually, like, as Marcelyn mentioned, like we actually started this project like the thesis from the previous semester, and in the beginning we even like look at a lot ideas of the left side accelerationism, like, which kind of like, I think the emphasis would be more on like how to, how we can like start to engage these new things, because since that, I don't think there's, instead of, you know, like trying to look for like the solution, it's more rather like a opportunity, as I would say. So that's why I don't have the correct answer for a lot of these questions, but I would say that's like, for me, that's like the step that I took to start figuring these things out. Yeah.
I mean, I would think that, you know, I mean, I think you started with something that has, you mentioned, and you know, about the acceleration stake on it, which is definitely really reflecting the idea of how you sort of defining and considering the network or the internet, etc. So at the same time, there's really two things. One, the starting point, which is a criticism of politics, economics, and the way we see the internet, and sort of escaping that kind of way of thinking into some other kind of project. So I think that's really another part that's really deeply connected with that, and the prompt automation and other things, right? But then the other take is really then the development of what the project really sort of intended to do, right? Of becoming sort of the exploration in and of itself about, you know, the software, the whatever you sort of design, right, in a way to sort of produce the project. So I think there's in a way two conversations, but they could be sort of connected, and you can go either way. What is really, and I think some of the questions begin to kind of try to engage that. So what is really the bigger picture, in a sense, of doing that? And at the same time, there's also the part of saying, okay, so what are the intricacies of the process in of itself, and the kind of technical aspirations and goals of it? But I think, but I think also the bigger question is actually quite important as well. And I think a lot of people are asking that, is like, okay, so what is the big picture besides that? And I think there's a way to really try to integrate that into the conversation at the end. It's really, how do we respond using AI, et cetera, to a larger question that has to do with the internet, architecture itself, agency, et cetera. So I think the questions are there, and it's just a matter of modulate those. But it's a tough proposition, and is really kind of very broad in many ways. So I commend that. I mean, to really try to engage something like that is really not very easy.
Great. I think that's a good closing comment, and thank you, Lawrence. A great job. We're going to move on to our final student for the afternoon session. Ken?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I'm gonna play my video with my pre-recording audio.
Ken, we can't hear the sound, and could you also go full screen? Make sure you share the sound.
Okay. Um, I'm sorry, Rollins, do you know where is can I share my computer sound?
Yeah, once you start sharing, there will be like a bar on the top, and then I think yeah, and you can right click the options.
Options. I didn't have
you see
options.
the options were like on the top.
Oh, okay, I got it.
Cool.
Thank you.
My thesis project is called Hyperfuture Architecture. My project.
Hold on.
My thesis project is called Hyperfuture Architecture. My project is focusing on the consequences of rethinking building design through privileging performative feature over programmatic typology. The thesis emerged from initial research during thesis prep and utilizing TSNE to understand how an image classifying neural network organizes plan precedents. The TSNE algorithm works by flattening hyperdimensional scores from an image classifier neural network into two dimensionals. The algorithm sorts input images by the proximity of their returned scores in the network. Simply speaking, TSNE privileges image features over disciplinary content. I input 3 plans of the precedents into TSNE to analyze their features and produce a reorganized image to study their adjacent features rather than a traditional classification of plan typology. This initial research into the TSNE led to a rethinking of architectural design as an assemblage of components with performative features whose adjacencies create deep heterogeneity into occupied spaces. Therefore, I've developed a catalog of modular components that are defined by their physical and spatial features which can be combined to serve a new program for mixed-use residential architecture. Module supports a range of programs including food service, REST, privacy, and automated retail through their embedding elements. This privileging of embedded features allows the same component to serve multiple program types. Additionally, some components feature digital screens, which can dynamically shift the ambient qualities of their adjacent spaces. Simultaneously, the digital LED screens also act as signifiers to aid in navigating the assembled stack by creating legible signage. These strategies allow for a functioning alternative to existing mixed-use building type through a hyper-entangling of programs in a dense spatial network. The project operates on a new framework where programmatic typology is no longer of primary significance. Performative features, embedded digital technology, and automated spatial management allow us to rethink existing models of building programs. So I think the architecture of the future will be an intense heterogeneity of interrelated programs. Visualizing it through augmented reality does allow me to understand how using AR as a way to explore heterogeneous conditions, both in terms of rethinking facade and also a consequence of building itself.
Yeah, I think that's all about my project. Sorry about the mistake.
No problem. Can you just set it to loop and then make sure you keep it full screen, but just yeah, mute the volume. Thank you.
Was the building example that you showed with that was generated from the algorithm, was it 100% generated from the algorithm, or did you add the hallways and pathways after to connect?
So actually, I didn't continue to use the TSNE technique, but the TSNE is kind of inspired me to rethinking about the feature and the program, the relationship between the feature and the program. So I didn't continue to use it, but TSNE is the tool for study some of precedents. Yeah.
So maybe, could you talk a little bit, I love this scene where it's sort of like the architecture is just kind of growing out of the ground, and we see these different types of features emerging. Some things repeat, there's like chunks of different tectonic systems. Could you talk a little bit about that? Like, what does this yield as a new whole? And how might it question previous ways of thinking about architectural components, about architectural tectonics? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So initially, I'm thinking about typology, the building type, but when we use a TSNE as kind of research about the architecture, I'm thinking maybe programmatic typology is no longer primarily significance, but the feature, we should focus on the feature. And then, so I kind of study from those chunks to study their program and then the feature. Yeah, and yeah, I think because I'm thinking, I think the more important thing is that why we should focus on the feature rather than the building, like a topology or building type.
Because I think that seems to be this sort of radical proposition, is that we would no longer occupy these architectures according to the kind of logics, the cues that might be given to us on the exterior of the building. At the end of the day, might actually not match up with what we would expect. Like in the one scene, you have the sort of piece from a cathedral or something where we you know, the expectation of what might occur within that space is being dismantled, I think, pretty actively. Like you're saying, there's no longer a one-to-one fit there. So I think that's kind of the provocation. I mean, there's an amazing, I think an amazing amount of work that you've done just looking at all of these constituents of your project. So I would really commend you on that. But I think that the issue of how does this then change the way we think as architects, and maybe some of the discussions, like when I saw that scene with the piece from the cathedral, I was thinking of Bernard Schumi and pole vaulting in the cathedral and sort of older discussions about program and in relation to form, or the idea of like generic form. And here you're saying there are various specific things that are produced, various specific features, but they might enable us to kind of think about program in a very different way and fracture, you know, what we think we know about conventional types.
I think that aspect certainly becomes clear. I think that, you know, if I understand, you took the AI process to a certain stage, after which you said, okay, I'm going to now develop this project given the, you know, the rich palette that gave me, correct? And I think that where I find your work very successful is when you look at the plans. I mean, it generated a plan for you that really has really unique outcomes, right? That can come from it, both in terms of the unit. I mean, this is a residential building. I mean, the end result of the kind of plan study, I would have really liked to maybe even see more just sort of a focus on plans, you know, as a way to, I think that I think you, in the other one, we sort of say, oh, you let the AI, you know, continue, and, you know, your authorship was not there. I think here, I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying actually that, you know, if I see a really interesting plan here that I think in your presentation could have been, you know, really, really successful. I think you jumped very quickly to the facade, and I think that was very interesting to you. Yet, I think there was still more to come in terms of how these different kind of the cellular, the tiny, the scale, the unit aggregation that can bundle and aggregate. And I think that there was more there in this process of just plans here, this one even. But then what I would have expected, and what I think might have been really helpful, would have been to then generate your own set of plans, right? That, you know, this is plan 1, plan 2, plan 3, plan 4. And I think the jump to take the exterior cues, you know, was a little fast, because I think, you know, some of them are a little mismatched to the plan at the moment. Whereas I think at the level of the plan investigations, I think that would have been an amazing thesis right there. But I'm missing the plans of these, you know, rather than it's kind of three-dimensional articulation. It would have been really interesting to see a plan of this, because this generated out of that very interesting process. But I think you made that jump into 3D. I still think going to 3D is very important, but I think it happened a little too early. But I think for your thesis, just even, you know, looking at your, you know, the original sources of indoor versus outdoor, and I think that's, you know, you've got a really good genesis of this here. But when I look at the facade, it's not really giving me, you know, perhaps like if you look at the, you know, the front of the facade there, it's sort of unused. And I think how the units can begin to come together, because ultimately what you want from a building like this is that when you look at the exterior, is that there is a new whole that emerges, right? And I think right now you still see the pieces. So all to say, I think that I really like the plans. I really like the plans. I wish you had drawn the plans. And I think that would have been a very nice way to explain your project. And I think just hold off on working that through a little bit before we get to the next intense challenge, which is how do these parts now become the whole? I think the plan would have told you the story of how to get there. But a really interesting process, and I really enjoyed looking at the presentation, and I completely appreciate the call to action on, well, what is this going to give me at the end? And so I completely understand that. But all to say, I think that you could come back to this, and you've got the process already here, so you can go into that depth of plans, and I think that would make for a marvelous presentation, and also for your portfolio.
I mean, I think that, I mean, I'm not really sure what you mean by features, right? But I think that the proposition of the radical aspect of the project, the provocation of the project is thinking, well, we're not thinking about typology. It's confusing right now, as is, the kind of the role of the plan, what the plan actually does, or how you build the modules. But it's really about, an architecture that is built out of assemblies, right? So it's kind of mariology of buildings that are kind of put together, right? And that is really, and all the kind of program becomes worked out individually or at a certain moment, which is not clearly explained. But I think what it produced at the end to me is really the condition about the familiar and unfamiliar, right? So you start kind of pushing the boundaries of what is familiar, what is unfamiliar in the aesthetic delivery of it. More than the kind of complex whole, whatever is really, I mean, to me, that would be much more an agenda of what it produces in terms of the product of the program, but also the notion of assembly and the aesthetic. The aesthetics are produced by the idea of that assembly and kind of pushing familiar and unfamiliar together. I think that's really, for me, what it provokes, the most in terms of the project.
Yeah, I mean, strangely, right? Like the appearance of the project is simultaneously brutalist and Gothic, and like other things in between. Like it's kind of interesting. I think like almost the sequence of presentations were done in such a way that it kind of foresaw what was talked about. If the project before this was kind of end of one spectrum in which kind of maybe push towards abstraction of the source material, towards kind of almost pure novelty. This one operates at the other end, where it's almost having hard time escaping the original source material. And I think for me, that's where the kind of crisis of the project lies a little bit. The process, I think, is super interesting. I actually really like the fact that it enters through kind of set of planimetric measurable drawings or images of drawings that begin to operate as a generative process. But it's not like plan generates the project, plan generates an object, and those through accumulation begins to produce this type of architecture. And like I like the way that it kind of moves in that sequence, and at some level, though, right, kind of active decision making as a designer gets involved. I guess the agency here in terms of how the designer participates, and in this case, you, of course, making setup decision in terms of the signifiers of architecture, like how much of an arch needs to remain as an arch, how much of a rose window needs to remain as a rose window, how much of these kind of elements that we identify as other architectures, other periods, other times, need to remain kind of pure to their origins, or are they kind of allusions to a condition that establishes the familiar and kind of new unfamiliar condition. And I think in some cases it remains too pure. In some cases, I think it works better. And I think that's a little bit of an aesthetic position one has to make, understanding how we can situate this within the history of architectural discourse. Are you like, is it too close to a typical notion of postmodernism that we understand in terms of idealized forms of, former architectures? and obviously divorced from any kind of context and implementation, or do they begin to kind of maybe get more abstracted to carve out new aesthetics and new positions in terms of how we think about assembly? You know, I was trying to kind of put the imagery of your project in the context of other cultural production, in the context of photography maybe, and immediately I started thinking about Philippe Dujardin's work, and I always wonder, like, if there was an interiority to Dujardin's work, what would it be? And I think in some way, for me at least, the project opens up kind of ways of thinking how we could look into projects where the interior worlds and the exterior worlds operate in completely different realms. However, you know, you might be, I think, you might have ended up in a situation where they were derivative from one another. I see, you know, less of a connection between the two. And to me, it's absolutely okay that you could have an agenda for the exterior and you could have an agenda for the plan. Those have different histories, different discourses, and they can be kind of less reliant on one another in terms of how they justify a project. But I think there's something quite interesting at the end, how these bits and pieces come together as assemblies and how you deal with the moments in between them. If in the previous project, that kind of difference between, let's say, different images, how it was interpreted, and I don't know, it's probably I'm wrong to call it blending, but some kind of negotiation of the difference of information that is left to be negotiated within the AI platform that suggests a connection or resolution between the two source images or many source images. Here too, I guess the obligation of, I guess, your agency or your hand is how you kind of put these things together. And I think that's a, you know, very traditional problem of collage. How do you kind of establish the seam as a condition of difference or as a condition that is resolved in such a way there is seamlessness? And of course, there are degrees in between many have operated. So I think it puts forward kind of old questions in new and old forms sewn together. And I quite enjoyed the project, I have to say. I'm maybe less compelled about the end of the presentation where the AR comes in the way it does. I think through these more typical conventions, to me, it resonates in a more provocative manner.
So for the AR part, actually I'm interested about the AR to do some AR stuff with the TSNE, and then we kind of jump into my thesis right now, like you see. So but I think AR as a tool to kind of can allow me to explore the different condition between the facade after TSNE analyzing and the building itself.
So, you know, it's interesting that the AR guy came first, you know, in the workflow, and then at a certain point, I think you and I were talking, and I just realized that the consequential building of your workflow, particularly in terms of like the way the program and the plan was organized, was far more interesting than the AR app. And so it's become a little bit of a vestigial thing. But I also, you know, I was just looking at this as a kind of comprehensive thing again. Like Dujardin was actually like one of your precedents that you were working with very early. So it's interesting that Kutan brings it up, but also I think it's probably fairly overt maybe in the project that was a reference in some ways. But that actual last composited image, even if it wasn't in an AR app, but was just where we're actually starting to see this thing within the context of the city, which itself has kind of heterogeneous character, is maybe like far more successful, at least in terms of the external or the exterior of your building. as representations in some of the other renderings, because in some ways the things that I've always found a bit troubling with this assemblage was the kind of really harsh indexing of the individual parts with these overscaled materials. But in that last image, they start to flatten a bit, and they actually start to seem more subversive in the way that they seem more plausible as a building facade in relationship to the context, which is, you know, in a photograph there, than it does in these kind of more abstracted renderings. But I mean, I definitely think that the kind of plan development that you've been producing from this is that if you have some time, I would definitely take it back in and dig in, because I think that you have created a really fascinating set of urban conditions within the interior of the project. And I wonder too, like we're talking a bit about that kind of animated plan sequence and animated section sequence. I think that there could have been a reading several years ago of this as some kind of dystopic project, but maybe the kind of cultural shift of understanding how we inhabit spaces is moving a little bit, that this feels less kind of excessively disorienting in a kind of Kowloon walled city type of way, and in some ways registers as more plausible. And so I kind of think that doing this like as a really explicit plan test and then comparing it to kind of other extant like housing plans would be fascinating to see, like if in reality you're actually kind of still creating these engaging spaces or navigable spaces, but without that kind of overt overlay of a party or a diagram on the project.
Maybe one suggestion also that I would have would be, as a kind of like post-production move, might be the way in which the whole narrative unfolds, like the connection between this AR part and the AI and the kind of questions about type. There might be, like after this is over, as Casey's saying, you know, for your portfolio, there might be another version, like V2 of this animation, of this film, where the project unfolds, and maybe thinking about ways that those two worlds get connected slightly differently. Because it felt like step by step by step, but I think you could sort of build the narrative in another way that might weave those differently. But again, I think it's a fantastic project. Really, congratulations.
Great. So are there any kind of closing comments for the group, or this is our last one today?
Really interesting questions. I mean, I kind of, maybe this is kind of a more general thesis comment. I think in the projects we've seen, there are issues students can carry forward and work for years to come. And a good thesis is something always that allows you to kind of take with you to other places and not be confined by site and program, etc., that you have engaged through this duration. I think, we've been talking about the projects in larger terms that kind of went beyond the definitions of what each project is, but allow us to kind of engage them on discursive terms. And I think that's precisely what you want from a thesis project. I don't know, I enjoyed the discussion, I enjoyed the provocations. I congratulate all the students.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would build on that. I mean, congratulations to all 5 of you. Each project had a distinct provocation, which I really enjoyed. And, the outcomes were not expected from the trajectory that you took. And I would second that. I think each of you have a set of questions and also methodologies that you can take with you after. And that is, I think, the that is the best scenario that you want out of a thesis project. And I can see how engaged each of you were in these topics, and relentless also in finding answers and beginning to develop the methodology that you did. And I think that all the questions that were raised by the critics are only ones that you don't need to engage right away, but I think it becomes a trajectory for your time after SCI-Arc, and that's a very good position to be in.
I totally agree with you.
No, I just want to say also congratulations to the advisors and to the students. I mean, I think I always look forward to the SCI-Arc thesis, because I think it's really is an exposure, really becomes kind of a thermometer in many ways of what's happening in the world, etc. So it's really being, you know, provoked by these projects really. So for me, I enjoyed tremendously. And sometimes I really don't know what to say. Sometimes I do, but I think that's really the point, that sometimes the projects are, you know, sort of embarking on territories that are sort of unusual. And I think that's really what you expect to do. And I think you guys were right on in that sense, with it, always with a kind of extreme sort of care and what is the trademark of the school. So I think it's, you know, it's really fantastic. Congratulations.
Thank you, guys. I wanted to thank the student, even though I've been in and out. I mean, this also is running, Lin, it's running on a loop, so I can see your project without your presentation. So Hina, Gabriel, and Kutan, thank you guys so much. You know, I can see how dark it's getting on your side of town. It's like, you know, it's nighttime. So, you know, we know that this is a whole effort of being stuck on Zoom for so long, and you guys are troopers. So thank you so much. I mean, I got text messages, I got comments, you know, with all the medium, all my devices are sounding that you guys were amazing critics. So